The growl came before the doors had finished closing, not the bark of a frightened animal, not the whimper of something confused or lost. This was low and sustained, a sound that moved through the linoleum floor of Bethesda Naval Medical Center's trauma wing and climbed the walls and settled somewhere behind every pair of eyes in the corridor. It was the kind of sound that made experienced people step back without consciously deciding to. Ranger stood in the center of the doorway to Trauma Bay 3. 40 kilograms of Belgian Malinois, black coat, amber eyes, ears forward and locked, chest barely moving. He had positioned himself with the calm precision of something that had been trained not for homes or parks or obedience trials, but for places where the difference between a wrong step and a right one was measured in seconds. The K9 unit patch on his vest, navy blue with a gold emblem, had been torn at the corner, and a thin line of dried earth still tracked across his left shoulder from wherever he and his handler had been before the helicopters brought them here. Behind him, on the hospital bed in Trauma Bay 3, lay Lieutenant Commander Caleb Harrow. 3 gunshot wounds, hemorrhagic shock. Blood pressure dropping in intervals the machines were struggling to track. The surgical team, 3 of the most decorated trauma specialists Bethesda had on roster for a Friday night, stood outside the door with their equipment prepped and their eyes on the dog, waiting for someone else to make the first move. For 6 hours, no one had. Master Chief Ronan Briggs occupied the corner near the vending machine at the far end of the corridor. He had not moved from that spot since the medevac landed. His dress uniform was still caked with dust from the airfield. His jaw had not unclenched in 2 hours. 3 nurses had approached him with questions. He had answered each one with a look that made them find somewhere else to be. Doctor. Fletcher Wynne emerged from the trauma briefing room at 23:17 hours. White coat pressed, silver hair precisely combed, carrying the particular authority of a man who had spent 22 years being the most important person in whatever room he entered. He assessed the situation in 4 seconds. His eyes went to the dog, then to the door, then to his watch. "Call animal control," he said, to no one in particular and everyone at once. Hazel Drummond, head nurse of the trauma wing for 11 years, was already ahead of him. She had a phone in her hand, thumb hovering. Behind her, Blake Hatch, a corpsman with 18 months in the unit and an expression that had never quite found the right setting for sincerity, leaned against the wall and watched. 6 hours, Blake said, mostly to himself, but loud enough to carry. And nobody's figured out how to move one dog. Nobody answered him. Most of them were too focused on the monitor readings visible through the observation glass to respond, or too tired, or, in the case of the 2 newer nurses near the station, too aware of what Ranger had done when the security guard had tried to use a catch pole at hour 2. Nothing violent, just a shift in posture and a sound from somewhere below the audible range of normal threat. The guard had developed a pressing need to be elsewhere. That was the moment Ivy walked around the corner from the east hallway. She was carrying a patient chart from a previous shift, her handwriting visible on the top sheet, neat and small. She was wearing standard-issue scrubs that had been through a long Friday, her hair pulled back with what appeared to be a ballpoint pen, serving as a hair tie. She was 5 feet and 4 inches of visible fatigue, and she moved through the corridor without the urgency that marked everyone else in it. Not because she was indifferent, but because she had taken in the whole picture in the time it took her to turn the corner and was already thinking 3 steps ahead. Hazel spotted her first. "Reyes, your assignment is room 7, second floor. This area is not your concern." Ivy glanced toward Trauma Bay 3. Through the observation glass, the monitor readings were visible. Her gaze paused on them for exactly 2 seconds. Not the kind of pause that came from unfamiliarity, but from the kind that came from calculation. "Yes, ma'am," she said, and did not move toward room 7. Blake pushed off the wall. "New one's curious," he murmured, directing it at the nurse beside him the way someone drops a match to see what happens. Ivy's eyes moved to the monitor again, then to Ranger. The dog was watching her now, had been watching her since she rounded the corner. She knew that, with that unreadable amber stillness that military working dogs carried like a second skin. Most people looked at a dog in that posture and saw aggression. Ivy looked at it and saw something else entirely. Recognition protocol. A trained animal running an assessment, filing the results. She stepped forward. "Reyes." Hazel's voice dropped half a register, which was her version of a warning shot. I will not repeat myself. The dog hasn't eaten since they brought him in, Ivy said, still facing Trauma Bay 3. He hasn't had water either. If you're going to call animal control, you should know that a dehydrated working dog under sustained stress is significantly less predictable than a stable one. A pause spread through the corridor like something dropped in water. Fletcher looked at her, then at Ranger, then at the nurses nearest the station. How would you know that? Fletcher asked, in the tone that experienced people use when they want the answer to be something dismissible. Ivy didn't answer. She was watching Ranger. Ranger was watching her. Across the 6 feet of linoleum between them, something passed. Not sentiment, not the particular softness that civilians sometimes projected onto dogs. Something more like verification. Ronan Briggs moved off the wall. He covered the distance between the vending machine and Ivy in 8 steps, stopping close enough to make the point physical. He was a foot taller than her, the kind of tired that came from 17 years of combat tours and no sleep. And watching someone who mattered to you bleed out on a helicopter floor was written into every angle of his face, and it was not a tired that made a person gentle. "Turn around," he said. Ivy looked up at him, not with defiance, not with the frozen expression of someone caught off guard. She looked at him the way someone looks at weather, noting it, factoring it in, continuing. "The animal control team will escalate him," she said quietly. "You'll lose another hour minimum getting him stable enough to move. And by then the window for the third wound." "What third wound?" "There are 3 entry points. The team working the primary sites missed the intercostal margin on the right side. The monitor will show you in the next 8 minutes if you want to wait for the machine to tell you." The corridor had gone quiet in the specific way that happens when something unexpected enters a room that thought it had accounted for all variables. Fletcher's jaw tightened. He looked at the observation glass. He looked at the X-ray mounted to the right of it, which he had reviewed himself 40 minutes ago. He did not immediately say she was wrong. If you've ever watched someone get dismissed in a room full of people who thought they had them figured out, this story is for you. Ivy walked into that corridor with nothing but her hands and her silence, and somehow a combat-trained dog chose her over everyone else. We're just getting started. Subscribe to Military and Veteran Stories so you never miss a story like this. And drop a comment telling us, have you ever watched someone be underestimated and then prove everyone wrong? We read every single one. Hazel moved between Ivy and the door. "Your assignment, Reyes, last time." "Yes, ma'am." Ivy looked at Ranger one more time. Then she turned and walked down the east corridor, chart under her arm, pace unhurried. She did not go to room 7. She rounded the corner, found the row of chairs along the auxiliary hallway wall, and sat. From that position she could see the edge of the observation glass. She opened the chart, set it across her knees, and waited. Raven Parks, a Navy corpsman who had been working trauma at Bethesda for 4 years, dropped into the chair beside her 3 minutes later. Raven had the compact efficiency of someone who had learned to do everything fast and had never quite unlearned it, even on the slow nights. She kept her voice below the ambient noise of the corridor. "You know Hazel's going to have you written up, probably. Then why are you still here?" Ivy's eyes stayed on the edge of the glass. "The dog hasn't moved from the door in 6 hours, but he broke position twice." She paused. "Once when they wheeled in the imaging equipment, and once when a nurse got within 2 feet of the IV line. Both times he went back to the door immediately after. He's not protecting the exit. He's protecting something specific inside." Raven stared at her. "You counted his position breaks." Ivy didn't respond. On the monitor, just visible through the observation glass, a number shifted. In the family waiting room at the end of the main corridor, Grace Harrow sat with a paper cup of cold coffee held in both hands, not drinking it. She was 61 years old, with dark hair gone mostly silver, and her son had inherited her eyes and her way of holding perfectly still when everything around her was moving. She had received the call at 1943 hours. She had been in her car and driving south on Route 297 by 1947. She had not cried yet. She was saving that for after. A nurse she didn't know appeared in the doorway and told her it would be a while longer. Grace thanked her. The nurse left. Grace looked at the paper cup and set it on the table beside her and folded her hands. Down the corridor, Fletcher Wynne had returned to the X-ray. He was looking at the intercostal margin on the right side. His chief resident, a young physician named Dahlia Cho, stood beside him with a stylus in her hand and said nothing, because she had learned in her first month under Fletcher Wynne that the time to speak was not when his jaw was set like that. Fletcher turned the image 1 degree left on the display. His expression did not change, but something behind it did. "Get the portable ultrasound," he said. Dahlia was already moving. Across the corridor, through the glass, Ranger had not moved. Colonel Raymond Cole arrived at 23:41 hours. He was a compact man with a lieutenant colonel's bearing and a colonel's jurisdiction, and the particular quality of stillness that came from having given orders in situations where the wrong order ended careers and the right one ended worse things. He wore his uniform with the unconscious precision of someone who had stopped noticing he was wearing it years ago. His aide, Lieutenant Jasper Graves, tall, efficient, carrying a tablet that never left his hand, materialized 3 steps behind him as though assembled from the corridor itself. Fletcher briefed him in 90 seconds. Cole listened with his hands at his sides and his eyes on the observation glass. "The dog," he said. "Operational K9, sir, cleared for theater. Unit designations on the vest. He won't allow access." 6 hours. "Yes, sir." Cole looked at the glass a moment longer. Then his gaze moved down the corridor, stopped at the auxiliary hallway entrance, and found Ivy sitting in the chair with the patient chart across her knees. She was looking at the monitor. Not at him, not at Fletcher, not at anyone. The monitor. "Who's that?" Fletcher followed his eyes. "Nursing staff. 6 months on this unit. She made a claim about a third wound site that turned out to be, we're currently investigating." Cole said nothing. He turned to Jasper Graves and said something at a volume that didn't carry to anyone nearby. Graves opened the tablet. Ivy, from the auxiliary hallway, did not look in their direction. She turned a page on the chart she wasn't reading. The portable ultrasound confirmed the third wound at 23:53 hours. Fletcher came out of Trauma Bay 3 with the look of a man recalibrating a measurement he had assumed was fixed. He walked to the center of the corridor. He did not look toward the auxiliary hallway. He spoke to his resident. "We need to prep for a modified approach. Get me the thoracic kit." Dahlia was moving before he finished the sentence. She passed the auxiliary hallway entrance and, without slowing, glanced at Ivy in the chair. Ivy was watching the monitor. Dahlia moved on, but she touched the edge of her coat pocket where her personal notebook lived and made a mental note. Blake Hatch materialized at Hazel's shoulder. So the new girl was right about the wound. Hazel did not acknowledge this. She was reviewing a scheduling form that had no bearing on the current situation, and the deliberateness with which she was doing it communicated everything she intended. "Lucky guess," Blake added, and went to refresh his coffee. In Trauma Bay 3, Caleb Harrow's vitals fluctuated in the range that kept monitors alarmed and surgeons steady and everyone else in the vicinity quietly terrified. His blood pressure was managing a fragile equilibrium that the team was carefully nursing. The machines breathed for him in part and monitored him in total, and none of them knew, because machines don't know things. That 6 hours earlier he had been conscious long enough to say 2 words to Ronan Briggs on the helicopter, and neither of those words had been about the pain. Ranger had not moved from the door. At 00:14 hours, Ivy stood up from the chair. She carried the chart back to the nursing station, filed it in the correct slot, and walked toward Trauma Bay 3. She did not detour. She did not hesitate. She walked at the same pace she had used all night, which was the pace of someone who had decided. Ronan saw her from his position at the end of the corridor and started moving. He reached her in the same moment she stopped in front of a ranger. The dog looked up at her. Ronan positioned himself between them, close enough that the height differential was the first thing anyone watching would register. "I told you to go," he said. "You told me to turn around," Ivy said. "I did." She looked at Ranger. "This is different. This is not your concern. He's dehydrated and he's been holding sustained alert for 6 hours in a confined indoor space. His cortisol response is going to bottom out. And when it does, the behavior shift will be faster than anyone in this corridor is going to be ready for." "How do you know what his cortisol response looks like?" Ivy crouched down. "Not dramatically, not slowly, not with the careful performance of someone trying to appear non-threatening." She went down in one smooth motion, the way someone sits when they are simply not concerned about the geometry of the situation. She was now at eye level with Ranger. The dog looked at her. His ears, which had been forward and locked for 6 hours, shifted, not back, not down, not the posture of aggression draining away into submission. They moved into the neutral set of a working dog in standby mode, waiting for a command from a source it recognized. Ivy said 2 words, quietly, in a cadence that was not the cadence of civilian dog training. Ranger stood, moved 2 feet to the left, and sat. The corridor held its breath, not because it was dramatic, because it was not. There was nothing performed about what had just happened, nothing that could be explained by the right tone or the right body language or the particular patience of a person who liked animals. There was a protocol in what she had done, a specific compressed sequence that was not taught anywhere outside of a classified K-9 operational training manual. And the people in the corridor who had spent any time near working military dogs felt the recognition of it before they could name what they were recognizing. Ronan Briggs had spent 17 years near working military dogs. He stood very still. Ivy straightened and looked at Fletcher. "I'd like to go in." Fletcher, for the first time since she had appeared in his corridor, paused before answering. The pause lasted 3 seconds. It was not a long pause in ordinary terms. In Fletcher Wynne terms, it was geological. "This isn't a teaching moment," he said. "I'm not asking to be taught." Another pause. Fletcher looked at Dahlia, who was watching Ivy with an expression. She was working to keep neutral. He looked at Hazel, who had moved to the end of the nursing station and was holding a clipboard with both hands. 2 minutes, Fletcher said. Ivy walked into Trauma Bay 3. Ranger followed her and positioned himself at the foot of the bed. He looked at Ivy, then at Caleb, then at Ivy again, and lay down. Ivy stood at the right side of the bed and looked at Caleb Harrow. For a moment she was simply still, not processing, not calculating, not doing the visible math that medical professionals sometimes perform in front of patients to demonstrate professionalism. She was looking at him the way someone looks at a situation they have encountered before and are placing in its correct category. Her hands were at her sides. The only thing that moved was her eyes, which tracked across his face, his color, the rate of his respiration, the positions of the drainage lines, the angle of the IV placement in his right forearm. Then she placed 2 fingers on his wrist at a position roughly a centimeter above where the standard pulse point sat. Through the observation glass, Dahlia Cho watched and touched her coat pocket again. Ivy stood at the bedside for 90 seconds. Then she turned to the IV setup and made 3 adjustments. Small, sequential, each one precise, to the flow rate and the angle of the line. She looked at the monitor. She looked at the drainage output. She straightened the secondary line that had been placed slightly off-axis and was creating a resistance point that the machine was compensating for, but not efficiently. From outside, Fletcher watched her hands. She turned to leave. Then she stopped, looked back at the monitor, and said, without raising her voice enough for it to reach the corridor, "The intercostal drainage is at 8.2. You need to watch that margin every 20 minutes. She walked out. Fletcher was waiting. "The intercostal pressure." 8.2, Ivy said. "The machine will flag it in 12 minutes if it continues, but you don't have 12 minutes of comfortable margin." The look on Fletcher's face was not one he was accustomed to producing. He turned to Dahlia. "Check it." Dahlia went in, came back out in 40 seconds. She spoke without looking at Fletcher first, which was something she had not done before in his presence. 8.3 now, she said. Fletcher looked at Ivy. Ivy was looking at the corridor floor with the expression of someone waiting for a train. Hazel stepped forward. "Reyes, I need you upstairs, now." "Yes, ma'am." Ivy picked up a secondary chart from the station rack. She did not look at Blake, who had returned from the coffee machine and was standing near the far wall with his cup held in front of him like something to hide behind. At the nursing station, Raven Parks watched Ivy walk toward the east stairwell. She watched the way Ivy's shoulders sat, the particular evenness of them. Raven had done 2 tours with Fleet Marine Force before her nursing certification. She knew what a person's shoulders looked like when they had been trained to present a neutral profile in high-stress environments. It was not something you unlearned. She filed it. Ivy reached the auxiliary hallway junction and stopped. She stood there facing the wall, as if checking something on the secondary chart. But her eyes were on the reflection in the polished metal of the fire safety cabinet, 6 feet to her left. A narrow, imperfect mirror that returned a view of the Trauma Bay 3 observation glass and the monitor behind it. The numbers shifted. She stayed. "Right now, Colonel Raymond Cole has just ordered a full background check on a rookie nurse who hasn't spoken more than 50 words all night. Lieutenant Jasper Graves is staring at a database result that should be impossible, and Ranger hasn't moved from Ivy's side since she walked through that door. If you're watching this and thinking something doesn't add up, you're right. Hit that like button and stay with us. The next 5 minutes will change everything you think you know about her. Jasper Graves had been running the background query for 11 minutes when the system returned its first flag. He read it, blinked, and read it again. Then he closed the distance to Colonel Cole in 8 steps and showed him the screen without speaking. The record on Maya Ivy Reyes was clean. Nursing license, certification history, employment record, all of it exactly what the file said. But between her completion of nursing school and her first day at Bethesda, there was a gap. 4 years. No address, no tax filings, no digital footprint of any kind. Where a life should have been. A person paying rent, using a bank account, renewing a driver's license, there was a flat line. Jasper had searched for gaps like this before, in a different context, for a different kind of file. He knew what they meant. He knew what kind of activity left that particular absence in a record. The way a removed photo leaves a brighter rectangle on a wall. Cole looked at the screen. He looked at the reflection of the east corridor in the glass partition across from him. He looked at the slim figure standing at the auxiliary hallway junction with a chart in her hands. "Run it again with the next clearance level," he said. "Yes, sir." Cole moved toward the corridor. He stopped beside Hazel Drummond, who was completing a shift reconciliation form with the focused energy of someone burning off tension through administrative process. He spoke quietly. "The nurse, Reyes, do not let her leave the floor." Hazel's pen stopped. She looked up. Cole had already turned away. In the auxiliary hallway, Ivy lowered the chart and looked at the fire cabinet reflection. The monitor numbers were holding. She folded the chart into a neat vertical orientation and stood with it held along her thigh and watched the corridor for 22 seconds. Then she turned and walked back. Raven appeared at her shoulder before she had gone 6 steps. "Hazel's going to pull your badge if you go back in. The 8.3 reading is going to hit 9 before the machine flags it," Ivy said. "By then, Fletcher will have already called for a procedure setup he doesn't need, and they'll waste 12 minutes reconfiguring." Raven stared at her. "How do you—" She stopped, started again. "Where did you work before here?" Ivy's pace did not change. "I'll answer that if you can tell me what March protocol is." The question landed in Raven's chest and sat there. Because Raven knew what March protocol was. She had memorized it during Fleet Marine Force training at 0530 one morning with a sergeant who had returned from Kandahar province with opinions about thoroughness, massive hemorrhage, airway, respiration, circulation, hypothermia. It was not a nursing school framework. It was not in any civilian ICU manual. It was a tactical combat casualty care sequence developed specifically for operators in environments where the nearest trauma bay was an 8-hour helicopter ride away. Raven said nothing, but her hand found the edge of her coat pocket the same way Dahlia's had, storing something she hadn't categorized yet. At the trauma bay 3 doorway, Ranger raised his head when Ivy approached. He did not stand. He watched her with the attentive stillness of an animal in a known and controlled situation. She paused at the door, looked through the glass at the monitor, and saw the number she had predicted. 9.1, she said. Fletcher was already inside. He had been watching the monitor since Dahlia's report. He turned when Ivy appeared in the doorway. His expression had cycled through several configurations in the last 40 minutes and had not settled on any of them. "You need to stay out. You need the intercostal line repositioned by 0.8 centimeters, Ivy said, "or you're going to spend the next 4 minutes managing a pressure response that's going to compromise what you just spent 3 hours stabilizing." The monitor alarmed, not dramatically, not the long sustained tone of a catastrophic event, but the short rhythmic alert that meant, "This number has left the range we set for it, and someone needs to make a decision." Fletcher looked at the monitor. He looked at the positioning of the drainage line. He looked at Ivy. "Come in," he said. She went to the left side. She moved Blake, who was standing at the secondary equipment rack, out of the way with a look rather than a word, and Blake moved without quite deciding to. She examined the intercostal drainage setup with both hands, her eyes tracking the full-line path, her fingers finding the resistance point at the midway anchor. She did not describe what she was doing. She simply did it, a correction that required the specific knowledge of what the problem was and where it originated. The kind of knowledge that didn't come from a textbook's diagram of an idealized setup, but from the particular experience of correcting this kind of deviation when the stakes were not academic. The monitor's alert stopped. The number settled. Fletcher stood across the bed from her and watched the screen, and said nothing for 12 seconds. which was, for him, a very long time. From outside the glass, Ronan Briggs had moved from his position at the corridor wall to the observation window. He stood there with his arms at his sides, watching Ivy work with an expression that was doing something complicated behind its surface. He had stood at that window for 6 hours, watching monitors and personnel in the interior of a room where someone he had served with for 9 years was lying connected to machines. He had watched doctors and nurses move through that room with the professional precision of people who were very good at a job he had spent his life depending on others to perform, while he performed different jobs in different rooms. He had not seen anyone move like that inside those walls. He had seen people move like that in other places. Places that did not have walls or monitors or linoleum floors. Places where the problem in front of you had a solution time measured in seconds rather than minutes, and the margin for procedural error was zero, and the weight of the moment was carried in the hands rather than in the paperwork that followed. He did not know what he was looking at yet, but the part of him that had spent 17 years reading environments and personnel and situations for information that didn't announce itself, that part was very awake. Ivy straightened from the drainage line. She looked at the monitor, a single complete sweep of the readings, numbers cataloged and compared against an internal baseline that was not visible to anyone else in the room. She adjusted the IV flow rate by a fraction that the machine would have registered, but that the nursing staff present would not have prescribed. She moved to the foot of the bed, checked Ranger, who regarded her with calm alertness, and then turned to go. She stopped. For just a moment, she looked at Caleb's face, the particular still quality of it that lay between sleep and the place further down. Something moved across her expression, too small and too fast for anyone watching through the glass to name, but the kind of thing that a person carries when they know the weight of someone else's survival. She left. In the corridor, she collected the chart she had left against the wall and walked toward the auxiliary hallway without looking at anyone. Blake said something to the nurse beside him that didn't carry far enough to be words. Hazel watched Ivy pass with an expression that had shifted since the drainage line incident, in a way that Hazel herself had not acknowledged. Colonel Cole was at the nursing station. He turned when Ivy passed, not abruptly, not with any performance of surveillance, just the quiet reorientation of a person who tracks moving things by nature. Ivy sat down in the auxiliary hallway chairs. Jasper Graves appeared at Cole's shoulder. He held the tablet at an angle no one else could read. His voice was below the ambient noise of the corridor. "Sir, I ran the second query with elevated clearance. The gap in the record didn't open. Instead, the system returned a single output line." Cole did not look at the tablet. He kept his eyes on the corridor. "What output?" "Access restricted, level classified, contact JSOC." The corridor continued its business around them. Monitors alarmed and were reset. A gurney moved through the far doors. 2 nurses changed shift at the station. Everything continued, carrying the ordinary appearance of a late Friday night in a facility built to manage emergencies. And under all of it, something else entirely was becoming visible to the people who knew how to look. Cole turned, very precisely, and looked through the observation glass at Trauma Bay 3, at Caleb Harrow, at Ranger, still at the foot of the bed. Then he turned and looked at the auxiliary hallway entrance, where Ivy sat with a chart across her knees and her eyes on nothing in particular, and her shoulders at rest in a way that was so controlled it was itself a kind of information. "Don't let her leave the floor," he said, and the quietness of his voice this time was different from the administrative authority of the earlier instruction. This was the quiet of someone who has just added an unexpected variable to a calculation they thought was complete. At the auxiliary hallway entrance, Dr. Silas Klein came around the corner from the main elevators. He was a compact man in his 50s, with the coloring of someone who spent extended time outdoors in harsh conditions, and he wore civilian clothes that sat on him with the same relationship to his body that civilian clothes always had on people who had spent long enough in uniform to feel the difference permanently. He had been called by Cole an hour ago, and had driven from Langley without stopping. He nodded at Cole from across the corridor, glanced at the observation glass, and then looked at Ivy. He looked at her for a moment longer than the moment required. Then he went to stand beside Cole. "Brief me," he said quietly. Cole did. Klein listened with his hands in his jacket pockets and his eyes on the monitoring glass. When Cole finished, Klein was quiet for 7 seconds. "The K-9 cleared her," Klein said. Yes. Trained military working dog, operational, won't clear a civilian without a command from a known handler. No. Klein looked at Ivy, then at the observation glass, then at the number on the monitor, which had stayed stable for the past 11 minutes. Who's the attending on record? Wynn, and she's correcting Wynn's drainage setup from the doorway. She walked in and fixed it, Cole said, on 2 separate entries, without being asked, without consulting the chart. Klein pressed his lips together. He took his left hand out of his jacket pocket and then put it back. He looked at the auxiliary hallway entrance. Pull everything, he said. Every clearance level you have access to. We're all ready. Pull everything, Klein said again. Inside Trauma Bay 3, the monitor held its numbers. Ranger lay at the foot of the bed and watched the doorway with the patient readiness of an animal that knew. Its next instruction was coming, just not yet. Caleb Harrow did not stir. His breathing was shallow, but present. His color had not worsened in the last 20 minutes, which was the best thing anyone could say about the situation. The machines measured him in numbers. The people outside the glass measured him in other ways. And at the end of this corridor, in the auxiliary hallway, the woman who had moved his K9 with 2 quiet words sat and watched the edge of the observation glass and waited, and did not look like someone who was waiting, and did not look like a 6-month nursing veteran at a Friday night trauma intake. She looked like someone who had been here before, in other configurations, in places that did not have this kind of ceiling or these particular machines. Someone who had learned to hold very still in rooms where the outcome was not yet determined, because movement for its own sake was a luxury that situations like this one did not offer. At 0132 hours, Caleb Harrow's monitor produced the alert that Fletcher Wynn had been watching for, and the team responded with the established protocol, moving efficiently and professionally through the first steps of a procedure designed for exactly this event. At 0133 hours, they hit the complication that the protocol had not specifically prepared them for, and the monitor changed its sound, and the room changed with it. Ivy was at the doorway before the second alert had completed its first cycle. She looked at Fletcher. He was already looking at her. Cardiac tamponade, she said. The room was moving. 3 people working at once, hands occupied, monitors alarming, voices calling out numbers. Fletcher stood at the center of it with his mind moving through options and their time costs and the particular arithmetic of emergency that he had practiced for 22 years. You're not qualified, he started. No, Ivy agreed. But pericardiocentesis needs to happen in the next 4 minutes, or the stabilization we've spent 3 hours building goes away. You know the procedure. It was not a question. She held his eyes. Give me the kit. In the corridor, Ronan Briggs heard the alarms and crossed the distance from the wall to the observation glass in 4 steps. He pressed one hand against the surface. Inside, through the controlled activity of the team, he could see Caleb's monitor and the way the lines on it were behaving, and his jaw set in the way it had before things he couldn't stop. Fletcher turned to the equipment rack. He turned back. 2 minutes, he said. If I say stop, you stop. Understood. Ivy crossed to the equipment rack and pulled the pericardiocentesis kit with the kind of targeted certainty that did not involve reading the label. She moved to the correct position at the bedside, established the angle, and began the procedure with her hands steady and her breathing steady, and her attention on the task in front of her with an exclusion of everything else that was, for the people watching, its own kind of testimony. Ronan at the observation glass saw this. He also saw something else. The positioning, the precise angle of her hands. The particular economy of the motion, not the economy of someone who had rehearsed in simulation, but the economy of someone who had performed under conditions that left no room for anything unnecessary, in places where the space between the movement and the outcome was absolute. He had seen this occur before, in operating rooms that were rooms, environments that were not designed for any of the purposes they were being used for, in situations that were later described in after-action reports using language stripped of everything that had actually been present. He had seen this, and he had not seen it here, not in this building, not from anyone in these scrubs. He pulled back from the glass. He looked at the door. He looked at the woman behind the glass. Who are you? He said. To the glass. To no one. The monitor alarm reduced itself to a single sustained note and then stopped. He had not asked permission. He did not intend to. In 17 years of operational service, Ronan had developed a finely calibrated sense for the difference between protocols that kept people alive and protocols that were performed for the benefit of the paperwork that followed. And right now, there was a woman inside that room with her hands on his teammate, and the monitor was doing something he had spent the last 40 minutes hoping it would not do, and no system of permission was going to keep him on the other side of a watch of glass. Fletcher turned when the door opened. "Sir, this is a restricted—" "I know what it is," Ronan said, and his voice had dropped into the register he used when he was not negotiating. He crossed to Ivy's side of the bed and positioned himself behind her left shoulder, eyes moving between the monitor and her hands and the angle of the procedure she was performing. Her hands did not waver. She did not look at him. Her attention was on the task in front of her with the absolute exclusion of everything peripheral that a person develops when they have learned to work while someone is firing at them, and the part of Ronan's training that processed environmental data without his conscious direction noted this and began running its own assessment. The monitor was producing numbers in sequence. The team around the bed was calling them out in the standard cadence. Ivy tracked each one with micro-adjustments that were too small to see clearly from behind her, but that showed their effect immediately in the next number the monitor returned. "Who taught you this?" Ronan said quietly, directly behind her. "Focus on the monitor," she said. "I am focusing on the monitor. Who taught you this?" She made a final adjustment, set the instrument down with a precision that meant it was positioned for retrieval rather than abandonment. Check the monitor, check the drainage line, check the rate of the secondary IV. "It's holding," she said to Fletcher rather than to Ronan. Fletcher looked at the monitor. The numbers had moved into a range he had been working toward for 3 hours. They were sitting there now with an almost aggressive stability, as though establishing their right to remain. Fletcher said nothing, which for Fletcher Wynne was its own complete sentence. Ronan moved around to Ivy's left side, between her and the doorway. He was making himself large in a way that was deliberate but not violent, the physical equivalent of a checkpoint, a demand for accounting. Ivy turned to face him. She looked up at him with the same quality of attention she brought to everything else in this room, complete, unperformed, and entirely unintimidated. "Caleb said 2 words to me on the helicopter," Ronan said, "before he went under. 2 words. I've been standing in this corridor for 6 hours trying to work out what they meant." "What were they?" Ronan looked at her for a long moment. The monitor beeped in its steady, recovered rhythm. Ranger, at the foot of the bed, had lifted his head and was watching both of them. "He said she's here," Ronan said. Something happened in Ivy's eyes. Not a crack. She did not crack, was not built for cracking, but a deepening, the way a body of water responds to a stone, not breaking, but shifting around, the weight. He wasn't delirious. I know what Caleb sounds like when he's delirious. I've heard it. This wasn't that. Ronan's voice had dropped further, not in volume, but in character, the way iron drops in temperature. He looked at me, and he said, "She's here," past tense, like he already knew, like he'd been waiting. Ivy set her hands at her sides. "The procedure is complete. The monitor needs to be watched every—" "Who are you?" The question was the same one he had said to the glass 20 minutes ago, but this time it had a different gravity. This time it was being asked by someone who already had half the answer and was standing inside the room where the rest of it lived. Ivy looked at him. "Ivy Reyes, nursing staff. 6 months on this?" "That's not what I'm asking." Outside the observation glass, Colonel Cole had moved to the window. Beside him, Silas Klein stood with his arms at his sides and his eyes tracking everything inside the room with the focused economy of someone cataloging information faster than he was expressing it. Behind them both, Jasper Graves held his tablet and looked at the screen and then looked at the room and then looked at the screen again. Dahlia Cho stood near the nursing station watching the observation glass. Raven Parks was beside her, one hand resting on the edge of the counter, not gripping it, not letting go. Noah Thompson had moved closer to the corridor window than strictly necessary, and was watching with the careful attention of someone who understood they were watching something that would not repeat. Hazel Drummond stood at the scheduling board with a pen in her hand and had not moved the pen in 4 minutes. Blake Hatch had set his coffee cup down somewhere and not picked it up again. Inside the room, Ronan reached forward, not to harm, not with the speed of violence, With the deliberate movement of a man who has made a decision and intends to see it completed, he took hold of the back of Ivy's collar, the folded fabric at the base of her scrub-top's neckline, and pulled. Not a jerk, not a tear, but a firm, sustained pull backward that was meant to draw her away from the bed and from the procedure and from whatever it was she was doing inside this room without authorization. The fabric pulled. The stitching at the left shoulder seam, worn from a long shift and the repeated movement of working at a bedside, gave. The collar tore. Ronan let go, stepped back, looked at what the torn fabric had revealed. The tattoo sat at the junction of her left collarbone and shoulder, positioned where the torn neckline now exposed it completely. Not decorative, not the kind of ink that sat on a person's body as a record of sentiment or aesthetics or a particular evening. This was a unit marking. The language of it was unmistakable to anyone who had ever worn one. A skull rendered in precise black linework with paired osprey wings spread behind it. The angle of the wings calculated to carry specific symbolic weight. Beneath the skull, positioned to be read even in low light, a hand-drawn 7 in the style that appeared in exactly one operational training document in the possession of exactly one branch of the United States Special Operations Command. And below the 7 in the smallest lettering, but the most definitive, Ghost. Ghost Unit 7. Ronan looked at it. The room had gone quiet in the absolute way, not the reduction of volume, but its complete removal, as though something had drawn all the available sound out of the air and left behind a medium that light moved through, but noise did not. 3 seconds. The monitor continued its beeping. The machines did not care about revelations. The IV drip counted its drops with mechanical indifference. The ventilation system moved air through its ducts in its ordinary way. These were the only sounds in Trauma Bay 3. 3 seconds. Ivy did not cover it, did not reach for the torn fabric. She stood with the marking visible and her shoulders back, and her eyes on Ronan with the composed steadiness of someone who has spent a long time carrying a weight in private and has just been relieved of the option. Ronan's face moved through 5 configurations in 8 seconds. The first was the sharp flicker of a man who has seen something unexpected. The second was the beginning of dismissal, the reflex toward the simpler explanation. The third was the moment the simpler explanation ran out of road. The fourth was something that had no clean name, but that involved the reassembly of an entire picture from pieces that had been sitting in plain sight for hours. The fifth was stillness. He looked at the marking. He looked at Ivy. He looked at Caleb on the bed. He looked back at Ivy. "Ghost Unit 7, he said. The words left his mouth with the weight of someone who knows exactly what they are saying and is saying it anyway to hear what the room does with it. Ivy said nothing. "Ghost Unit 7 was Marsoc." Ronan's voice had gone somewhere quiet and careful, the way a person speaks when they are handling something that could break. 3 classified operations, Kandahar in 2009, Mosul in 2010. He paused. "And a third one that I can't name, in a place I'm not supposed to know about." Ivy was still looking at him. 7 members, Ronan said. 5 confirmed KIA. 2 listed as MIA. He stopped. "We stopped looking for the MIA after a year. He stopped again. His jaw worked. "They told us there were no survivors from the 3rd operation." "They believed it," Ivy said. The 2 words sat in the room. Outside the observation glass, Silas Klein had both hands out of his jacket pockets. He was standing fully upright, the slight forward angle he habitually carried now replaced by a rigid vertical that was purely involuntary. He was looking at the tattoo. He could see it clearly from the window. He had seen that marking twice before in his career. Both times it had been on the personnel files of people described in the past tense. He turned to Cole. Cole was already looking at him. Neither of them spoke. In the corridor, the quality of the silence was spreading. Dahlia had moved 2 steps closer to the window without registering that she'd done it. Raven's hand had tightened on the counter. Noah had his phone in his hand and was staring at it, not because he was looking at the screen, but because having something in his hand seemed important. Hector Mendez, the Army corporal who had been sitting in the visitor area at the end of the corridor for the last 40 minutes, waiting to check on a soldier in a different room, had stood up from his chair. He did not know why. He had heard the change in the corridor's atmosphere, and his body had responded before his mind had found the reason. Blake Hatch was very still against the far wall. Hazel Drummond's pen was at her side. Inside Trauma Bay 3, Ranger stood up from his position at the foot of the bed. He walked to Ivy's left side, the side with the marking, and sat. He pressed his shoulder against her leg in the way that working dogs press against their handlers when the environment requires acknowledgement. Not comfort, recognition. Ronan looked at the dog, then at Ivy. "Kandahar," he said. 2009. There was a building, a compound that collapsed during extraction. Caleb's team was inside. His voice had the stripped quality of someone recounting a thing they have memorized from an after-action report that they have read many times in private. 3 operators were still alive when the structure came down. Standard protocol was abort. The extraction window was gone. The team outside, he stopped, started again. Everyone outside the building was pulled back. That was the call. That was the correct call. Ivy waited. "Caleb was the only one who came out," Ronan said. "We never understood how. He wouldn't talk about it afterward. Not in any debrief. Not to anyone. We thought it was survivor response. We gave him space." A pause. "He's never talked about what happened inside that building." "No," Ivy said. "He hasn't." The word has settled with the particular weight of someone who was present for the thing being described. Present and material to its outcome. Ronan looked at her for a long time. Then he stepped back. Not in retreat, in adjustment. The way a person recalibrates their posture when they have been holding a position based on a misreading, and the misreading has been corrected. "You got him out," Ronan said. Ivy's eyes went to Caleb on the bed. "He got himself out! I made sure he had something to get out to." The monitor beeped. The IV dripped. Ranger pressed against Ivy's leg and did not move. Outside the glass, Silas Klein turned to Jasper Graves. He held out his hand for the tablet. Graves gave it to him. Klein typed a query that took 6 seconds and used an access code that the query system at Bethesda Naval Medical Center did not usually receive, and the response came back in 3 seconds. And Klein read it again, and then held the tablet so that Cole could see the screen. The file was not redacted, not at this clearance level. At this clearance level, the file was complete. Photograph. A younger version of the woman standing in Trauma Bay 3, her hair shorter, her face carrying the particular quality of someone recently returned from an environment that changes faces. Rank insignia. Unit designation, operational record, Ghost Unit 7. MARSOC. 3 classified operations, 23 personnel recovered across those operations under hostile conditions. The Kandahar compound extraction, which was listed in the file as a separate appendix, because what had happened in that building in the 11 minutes between the structure's partial collapse and Caleb Harrow's emergence from the rubble, was classified at a level that most of the people in this corridor did not have access to and would not have access to for a long time. At the bottom of the file, in the field where current status was recorded, missing in action. Date, March 15th, 2011. Presumed. The word had been added in a different font, by a different hand, at a different time. Dead. Cole read it. He straightened. He turned to look at the door of Trauma Bay 3. Then he did something that Jasper Graves would record in his mental log of the night and return to for years afterward. Colonel Raymond Cole, 17-year officer, 3 combat deployments, a man who had, in the course of his career, received and delivered information of extraordinary weight, without producing any visible response, took one breath that was different from the breath before it. Then he walked to the door of Trauma Bay 3 and opened it. He stepped inside. He stood at the foot of the bed beside Ranger. He looked at Ivy. He looked at the tattoo, still visible where the scrub top was torn. He looked at the marking for 2 seconds in the manner of a man confirming a measurement. Then he came to attention, not the administrative straightening of a senior officer in a facility setting. The full, formal come-to-attention of a military officer rendering honors, heels together, arms straight, chin level, spine aligned, and he held it. Silas Klein came through the door behind him. He looked at Ivy. He looked at the marking. He came to attention beside Cole. Fletcher Wynne stood across the bed from all of them. He had a great deal of experience and a great deal of knowledge, and he was, by any measure that his profession used, very good at what he did. He understood anatomy and pressure and the chemistry of blood and the behavior of trauma at the cellular level. He did not fully understand what was happening in his trauma bay at 0147 hours on a Saturday morning, but he understood enough to step back from his position at the monitor and be quiet. In the corridor, through the observation glass, the change in the room was visible. Dahlia saw it first. She made a sound that was not a word. Raven looked where Dahlia was looking and went still. Noah's phone was in his hand, and then it was up, pointed at the window, the instinct preceding any conscious decision. Hector Mendez, at the end of the corridor, saw two senior officers come to attention inside a trauma bay, and his own body answered before he knew the reason. He straightened. He pulled his shoulders back. He looked toward the room with the focused attention of a soldier who recognizes a moment of honors without necessarily knowing who it is being rendered to. Grace Harrow appeared in the corridor doorway. She had heard the alarms 12 minutes ago, and the nurse who had been watching the family waiting room had stepped away, and Grace had stopped waiting for someone to tell her it was all right, and had come to find out for herself. She stood in the doorway and looked at the observation glass and saw the two officers in the attitude of formal attention and saw her son's face through the glass and pressed both hands against the door frame. Inside, Ivy looked at the two officers, at Cole's face, at Klein's. "Stand down," she said quietly. "Please." Cole held the position for 3 more seconds. Then he dropped, the way formal attention drops, completely, precisely, at once. Klein followed. Cole looked at her. "We need to talk." "Yes," she said. "After he wakes up." Cole looked at Caleb, looked at the monitor which was holding its numbers, looked at Ivy. "Yes," he said. "After he left." Klein remained 1 moment longer, looking at Ivy with an expression that held something more personal than rank. Something that may have been apology or may have been the recognition of a debt too large to name in the present context. Then he followed Cole out. The door closed. Ivy stood at the bedside. Her left hand came up and touched the torn edge of her scrub top's neckline, not covering the tattoo, just holding the fabric. Ranger leaned against her leg. The monitor beeped. She looked at Caleb's face. 4 minutes, she said to Fletcher quietly. "Watch the intercostal reading at the 9-minute mark." Fletcher nodded. He did not say anything else. There was not, at present, anything else he was qualified to say. In the corridor, it was not silence anymore. It was something else, a changed atmosphere, the air pressure of a room after something large has moved through it. Voices had returned, but they were lower, more careful, placed with awareness of their surroundings in a way they hadn't been an hour ago. Raven found Ivy at the auxiliary hallway chairs, sitting in the same position she had occupied for most of the night, with the same chart across her knees that had not been read since approximately 23:30 hours. Raven sat beside her. She did not immediately speak. She was the kind of person who had learned the difference between silence that needed breaking and silence that needed company, and she sat in it for a moment before she decided. "I want to say I'm sorry," Raven said, "for not speaking up earlier. When Hazel—" "You didn't know?" "No." Raven looked at her hands. But Ranger knew. Ivy's eyes went to the doorway of Trauma Bay 3, where Ranger had returned to his position, no longer guarding it, but present, occupying space near the person he had not left in 6 hours. "He has a good read on people," Ivy said. Raven was quiet for a moment. "The March Protocol," she said. "Where did you—" "A sergeant in Kandahar province," Ivy said. 0530. He had opinions about thoroughness. Raven looked at her. Something shifted in Raven's expression, a reshuffling of an equation that had been producing an incomplete result and was now, with the new variable, resolving cleanly. "The 4 years," Raven said. "In your record." "Yes. Were you—" Raven stopped. "Chose a different approach. Were you okay?" "During." Ivy looked at the wall across the corridor, at the safety certification placard, at the fire exit sign above the stairwell door. "I was where I was supposed to be," she said. It was not an evasion. It was the most complete answer she had available, and Raven recognized this and did not push further. She sat for a moment longer. "The dog was right about you," Raven said. "Ranger's always right," Ivy said. "That's why they use him." At the nursing station, Hazel Drummond had returned to her scheduling board. Her pen was moving now. The form she was completing was the shift performance record for the current night's staff, a document she had signed and filed every week for 11 years with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly what each section required. She reached the field for night shift nursing personnel. She paused over Ivy's entry. The standard procedure was to rate and annotate. Hazel had, in the ordinary course of this evening, had a clear and specific set of annotations prepared. She put her pen to the paper. She wrote in the column reserved for performance assessment 2 words. Then she closed the folder and placed it in the completed stack without looking at it again, and went to do something that required being at the other end of the corridor. Cole materialized at Ivy's auxiliary hallway position at 0214 hours. He did not sit. He stood at the edge of the hallway entrance with his hands at his sides and looked at her with the assessment of someone who has processed new information and is beginning the next stage of the operation that new information requires. "JSOC wants to speak with you," he said. "I know. Klein said to tell you the conversation is at your discretion, time and format. That's considerate of them." Cole was quiet for a moment. "You've been working here for 6 months." "Yes." "As a nurse?" "Yes." Cole looked at the floor, then at the wall, then at Ivy, with the particular directness of someone who has decided to say the thing rather than negotiate around it. "Why?" he said. Ivy looked toward Trauma Bay 3. Through the glass, the monitor's numbers were visible at this angle, small but readable to someone who knew what to look for. "I needed somewhere to be," she said. "You could have—" "No," she said, not harshly. "I couldn't have." Cole held this. He was a man who had spent his career managing the space between what could be said and what was understood, and he recognized when he was in that space. "After he wakes up," he said, echoing her own condition back to her. "Yes." He left. Klein appeared in his place 30 seconds later, which Ivy had more or less anticipated, because that was how these things worked. The formal conversation and then the informal one, both necessary, each with its own freight. Klein stood where Cole had stood and looked at the same patch of corridor floor, and then at her. "The Mosul operation," he said. "I know you were on the assessment," Ivy said. "I wrote the report on the 3 MIA declarations." He paused. "I wrote yours." The corridor moved around them. Somewhere a gurney. The sound of a radio at low volume from the break room 20 feet away. The ventilation system's ordinary breath. "The report was accurate with the information available," Ivy said. "You were alive. The information available didn't include that." Klein pressed his lips together. He had the look of a man who has rehearsed an apology in several different configurations and found each of them inadequate. And the inadequacy is something he has had to make a separate peace with. "There are 2 names in that file," he said. 2 MIA, not confirmed deceased. Ivy looked at him. "You're one," he said. "The other, I know who the other is." Klein's expression shifted. "The call tonight," he said. "The one at 0430 that JSOC placed." Ivy had not told him about the call. She filed this information and looked at him. "They know something about the other name," Klein said. "That's why they called." The corridor was quiet around them in the way that corridors are quiet at 02 hours on Saturday morning, when most of the facility is occupied by the specific sleep of the sick and the specific wakefulness of those responsible for them. In the stillness, the sound of the monitor from Trauma Bay 3 was audible. Ivy stood. She folded the unread chart into a neat rectangle and set it on the chair she'd occupied for most of the night. And she walked down the corridor toward Trauma Bay 3, without hurrying, with the same even pace she'd carried since she first appeared at the East Hallway Junction 6.5 hours ago. Ranger looked up when she approached. He rose, stretched, the full-body extension of an animal that has been stationary too long, and pressed against her right leg. She put her hand briefly on his head. He leaned into it. She went to the door. Dahlia was inside, monitoring. She looked up when Ivy entered, and something in her face had changed since the earlier hours of the evening. Some arrangement of professional distance had been replaced by a different quality. Something closer to the way a person looks when they have spent time with someone whose presence they have been consistently undervaluing and are now recalibrating. "He's been more stable," Dahlia said. "Last 40 minutes. "I know," Ivy said. "I was watching the monitor." She stood at the right side of the bed. She checked the IV line, the drainage output, the positioning of the secondary leads. She adjusted nothing. Everything was where it needed to be. She was checking not because she needed to, but because the act of checking was the only form of keeping watch that was available to her in this space. And she had been keeping watch, in one form or another, for a long time. She was looking at Caleb's face when his eyes opened. Not gradual, not the slow surfacing of someone returning from ordinary sleep. The operational wakefulness of a person whose nervous system had been trained to return from unconsciousness, ready for immediate assessment, eyes open, pupils tracking, orientation rapid. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at the IV. He looked at the monitor. He looked at Dahlia. He looked at Ivy. He stopped. For a long moment, the only sounds were the monitor and the ventilation and the distant radio from the break room. Then Caleb Harrow said, with the voice of someone who has not used their voice in several hours and is working around this fact, "Medic 7, the words arrived in the room and changed it. Not a question, not a statement of surprise. The recognition of someone naming a thing they have known was present before they found the confirmation. The way you say the name of a song when you finally remember what it is. Certainty before explanation." Ivy looked at him. "You're still here," he said. "I'm still here." His eyes went to the ceiling for a moment. Something moved across his face that was private, that had the character of a debt being acknowledged in a language with very few words. "The building," he said. "Don't. I need to—" "You don't need to do it right now," she said. "Right now you need to let the monitor do what it's doing and stop moving your left arm." He stopped moving his left arm. The ghost of something that might have been, in someone else's face, the beginning of a smile came and went. 6 hours, he said. 7, approximately. Ranger? Outside. He let you in? Yes. Caleb looked at her. His eyes were doing the work of a person who is rebuilding a picture from fragments. The pieces present in memory, the pieces present in the room, the pieces present in the face of the person standing at his bedside. "I told Ronan," he said. "I know what you told him. He didn't understand. He understands now." Caleb's eyes went to the doorway where Ronan Briggs was standing. Ronan had appeared without announcement, with the silent movement of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment and had been positioned near it for some time. He stood in the doorway with his hands at his sides and his face carrying something that 17 years of operational experience and a professional commitment to readable stoicism had not quite prepared him for. Caleb looked at his teammate, then back at Ivy. "He's going to have questions," Caleb said. "He already asked the important one," Ivy said. "I answered it." Caleb was quiet for a moment. The monitor beeped. Outside, Grace Harrow's voice was audible in the corridor. She had found her way to the door, and Dahlia was speaking with her in the low, careful tones of someone delivering good news that they want to deliver correctly. "Why here?" Caleb said. "Why this hospital?" Ivy looked at the IV line, at the drainage output, at the small cluster of adjustments she had made over the course of the evening that the monitors were now reflecting in their stable numbers. "Because you were here," she said. Caleb held this. "You knew I'd be here," he said. It was not an accusation. It was the observation of someone who knows how operational awareness works. "I keep track," she said simply. From the doorway, Ronan made a sound that was not a word. He came to the foot of the bed. He looked at Caleb. He looked at Ivy. He looked at the tattoo, still visible where the scrub top was torn. He looked at the tattoo for a long time. Then he put his right hand over his chest. Not a salute, not the formal military gesture that Cole and Klein had performed, but something older and more personal. The gesture of someone standing at the intersection of debt and recognition, and finding that the formal vocabulary is insufficient. He held it. Ivy looked at him. She gave one small nod. Ronan dropped his hand. 14 years, he said. "We thought—" "I know what you thought. Where were you?" She looked at the window. The glass was dark at this hour. The corridor lights reflected back at them. "Somewhere I needed to be, and then somewhere else, and then here." "That's not an answer. It's the answer I have right now." Ronan looked at her for another long moment. Then he looked at Caleb. Something passed between the two of them. The wordless exchange of people who have been through situations that require no words to describe between those who were present. "Okay," Ronan said, and then after a pause that had the weight of 14 years in it, "Thank you." He turned and left the room. In the corridor, the change was continuing. Hazel Drummond had not returned to the scheduling board. She was at the window of the family consultation room, which looked out over the parking structure, and the fluorescent light above her was producing the kind of quality of illumination that made everything look equally exposed. She stood with her arms at her sides and her clipboard somewhere. She had set it down and not picked up again, and she was looking at the parking structure with the focused expression of someone engaged in internal accounting. 11 years as head nurse of the trauma wing. 11 years of maintaining a standard that she believed, genuinely believed, kept the unit functioning at the level its patients required. 11 years of measuring personnel against that standard with a consistency she had always considered a form of respect for the work. She had measured Ivy against it, had found Ivy short, had acted on that finding with the decisive efficiency that 11 years of authority had refined. She was currently in the process of understanding how thoroughly wrong she had been, and this process had the particular quality of being both inescapable and deeply uncomfortable, which was, in Hazel Drummond's experience of the world, usually the sign that something true was happening. She did not go back to the scheduling board. She went to find Cole instead. Cole was in the corridor. He listened to what she said, briefly, without interruption, without the administrative distance she usually required of herself in conversations with superior officers. Then he said something in return. She listened. She nodded. She thanked him and left. The email reached Jasper Graves's tablet at 0312 hours. The subject line referenced a new internal review protocol for trauma wing patient care standards. Graves filed it without comment. Fletcher Wynne was in the hallway outside Trauma Bay 3. He was not doing anything in particular. He was standing in the hallway with his hands in the pockets of his white coat, looking at the observation glass, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man engaged in a private conversation with his own assumptions and finding that conversation long overdue. Dahlia came out of the room at 0248 and almost walked into him. "He's awake," she said. "Stable." She stopped. She looked at Fletcher with the careful assessment of someone who has spent months reading a person she finds difficult to read and is now calibrating a new set of data. The drainage line held. The modifications she made held. Fletcher looked at the glass, at the room inside, where the monitor was showing numbers he had been working toward all night. "Get me the complete record," he said. "Everything she did in there, every adjustment." He paused. "I want to review it." Dahlia looked at him. The particular character of the pause before her response was one she usually worked to eliminate from her manner in his presence. This time she let it sit. "Yes," she said. "I'll get the record." She went. Fletcher stayed at the glass. He watched the monitor. He watched Caleb, awake and tracking in the bed. He watched Ranger through the doorway, visible just at the frame's edge, sitting in the corridor with the particular alert composure of a working dog at rest. He stood there for 6 minutes. At 0322 hours, Grace Harrow was in the room. She had not asked permission, the way that mothers do not ask permission when there is no longer a good reason to stand between them and their children. The nursing staff had been informed that she could go in, and she had gone in, and she was sitting at the chair beside Caleb's bed, with both his hands in hers, and her eyes doing the particular work of a person checking a beloved face for confirmation that it is still present in the world. Ivy was in the corner. She had been about to leave when Grace arrived, and she had held position out of the instinct of not disrupting something that needed to happen without her. Grace looked up. She looked at Ivy with the eyes of someone who doesn't know the whole story, and knows she doesn't know it, and is making her own assessment with the information available to her. "You were here," Grace said, not asking, not thanking, noting a fact. "Yes, ma'am." "All night." "Yes, ma'am." Grace looked at her son's face, then at Ivy, then at the tattoo, visible where the scrub top was still torn. She didn't ask about the marking. She may not have known what it was, but she looked at it the way a person looks at a fact they don't have a name for but can feel the weight of. "Thank you," she said. Simple. Without performance. The thing itself, no larger or smaller than necessary. Ivy looked at Caleb. His eyes were closed again. Sleep this time. The real kind. The monitored and stable and restorative kind. And his color was better than it had been at any point in the evening, and the machines were saying reasonable things. "He did the hard part," she said. Grace was quiet for a moment. "He never told me what happened," she said. "In Kandahar, he came home and he was different, and he never told me what happened in that building." Ivy said nothing. "Did you know him before?" The monitor beeped. The IV dripped. Ranger from the corridor was visible just at the door frame, sitting, watching, present. "For a short time," Ivy said, "in a difficult place." Grace absorbed this. She looked at her son's face. She looked at Ivy. "Will you, after all this?" She paused, searching for the language. "Will you be around?" Ivy looked at the window, the dark glass, the corridor lights reflected in it. "I don't know yet," she said. "There are some things I need to figure out first." She left the room quietly, the way she had done everything in the course of the evening, without announcement, without drama, with the simple purposefulness of someone who knows where they are going and what the next step is. Hector Mendez was in the corridor. He had been there since the salute. He had not left when his own visiting window had closed, had not presented any particular justification for remaining. He had simply stayed, in the way that certain people stay when they have understood that something important is happening around them and they are not willing to leave the vicinity of it. He straightened when Ivy appeared in the doorway, completely, instinctively, with the alignment of a person whose body remembers a vocabulary that nothing has taken from it. "Ma'am," he said. He had not met her. He had no information beyond what the evening had provided. The corridor, the officers, the atmosphere of the room when the ranking personnel stood at attention. He had enough. Ivy stopped. She looked at him. Really looked at him. The full attention she brought to everything. Nothing performed. Nothing withheld. "Thank you for your service, Ikaz," she said. He held his position. "Thank you for yours, ma'am, for all of it. The parts we know about and the parts we don't." He said it plainly. The way soldiers speak when they are not performing but simply meaning the thing. Ivy received it the same way. Not deflecting, not minimizing, letting the acknowledgement be what it was. She nodded once. She walked on. If this story hit you somewhere real, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. A veteran, a nurse, a friend who never gets the credit they deserve. Before you go, tell us in the comments, what do you think Ivy does next? We'll feature the best answers in our next video. Subscribe and stay close. The mission isn't over. Noah Thompson at the far end of the corridor had been holding his phone for 20 minutes. He had footage of the corridor, the salute through the glass, the changed atmosphere, Ranger at the doorway. He had not posted any of it. He was looking at it now with the particular uncertainty of someone who has documentation of something they're not sure belongs to the world yet. He turned the phone over in his hands. Then he sent one clip, 11 seconds, Ranger sitting in the doorway, Ivy's hand on his head, to the veterans group chat he'd belonged to since discharge. No caption, no context. The first response came in 40 seconds, then 12 more in the following minute. Then the notifications became too fast to read individually. He put his phone in his pocket. Blake Hatch found the supervisor's email in his inbox at 0340 hours. The request for an interdepartmental transfer, which he had submitted through channels at 0230, citing professional reasons he had described in general terms, had been received and was under review. He read it. He put his phone in his pocket. He went and collected his coffee cup from wherever he had set it and washed it at the sink in the break room, and did not return to the corridor. Dahlia Cho was at the nursing station reviewing the complete record of Ivy's interventions across the night. She had her personal notebook open beside the official chart, the notebook she had been touching since the early hours, the one where she kept the things she was still processing. She had written in it 8 times over the course of the evening. She wrote in it once more now, a single line, and underlined it. At 0412 hours, Cole found Ivy at the end of the corridor, at the window. The facility stretched out below them in the particular quiet of early morning. Parking structures, access roads, the edge of the grounds with its carefully maintained paths leading nowhere in particular, in the dark. He stood beside her. He looked out the window. "Klein tells me there are 2 names in the MIA file that are unresolved," he said. "You're one." "Yes, the other one," he said. "JSOC has information." That's what the call was about. Ivy looked at the window, at the darkness outside it, at the lights on the access road below, moving in the pattern of early Saturday traffic. "How current?" she said. "Recent. Within the last 30 days. She was very still. "Klein says the conversation is at your discretion," Cole said. "Time and format as before, but he wants you to know that the information is—" He said to use the word urgent. He doesn't use that word when he doesn't mean it. "No," Ivy said. "He doesn't." The window reflected them both back. Cole with his uniform still precise at 04 hours. Ivy with the torn scrub top and the marking visible, and the hair pulled back with the ballpoint pen that had been serving as a hair tie since before midnight. "What do you need?" Cole said. Ivy considered this. The question had not been asked often in her experience, not by people with the authority to actually address the answer. When it was asked, it deserved a precise response. "Time," she said, "until he's stable enough to leave the building without a monitor. That's 48 to 72 hours. Then 48 to 72 hours. JSOC, 48 to 72 hours, she said again. Not firmly, not with the quality of a command, with the quality of a person who has been asked what they need and has given an accurate answer. Cole looked at her for a moment. Then he took out his phone and composed a message that took approximately 20 seconds and sent it. He put the phone back. Klein will tell them, he said. They won't be happy. They rarely are, Ivy said. Cole almost said something. He stopped himself. He looked out the window. The file lists 23 personnel recovered, he said, across 3 operations. 23 confirmed, Ivy said. There were others that didn't make the official record. Cole held this. He looked at the access road below, at the lights moving on it. The nursing school, he said. The 6 months here. The record with the 4-year gap. Yes. That was deliberate. Yes. You built it. With help. Cole looked at her. Who helped? Ivy turned from the window. She looked at him with the complete, uncalculated attention she brought to everything. That's a conversation for a different clearance level, she said. Cole held her gaze. He nodded, not in agreement exactly, but in acknowledgement, which was the appropriate response to something that was neither a refusal nor an invitation, but simply the honest description of a boundary. She walked back toward Trauma Bay 3. At the foot of the bed, Ranger was asleep. Not the sentinel posture of the last 7 hours. Actually asleep, head on his paws, chest rising and falling in the slow rhythm of a working animal that has completed its task for the day. He had not left the corridor outside the room. He had not been asked to. He lay in the hallway at the exact point where the door's swing would touch him, if opened fully, which meant that nothing could enter or exit without his awareness. Even asleep, he maintained his post. Ivy stood at the observation glass. Caleb was sleeping. Grace had moved her chair to the side of the bed and was sitting with her hand resting near but not on her son's, and her eyes were closed, though she was probably not sleeping. The monitor was producing numbers that were, by any measurement, good. Dahlia appeared at Ivy's shoulder. She held a folded piece of paper. Torn from her personal notebook, Ivy could see the edge of the binding where it had been removed. I wrote down what I observed, Dahlia said. Everything from when you arrived tonight. Adjustments, sequence, reasoning, as I could infer it. She paused. I want to learn it, properly. I want to understand what you did. Ivy looked at the paper, at Dahlia. Some of it's not in any civilian manual, Ivy said. I know, Dahlia said. That's why I'm asking you. Ivy took the paper. She unfolded it and looked at what Dahlia had written. It was precise, organized, and demonstrated that Dahlia had been observing more carefully than her position near the periphery of events would have suggested. This is good work, Ivy said. Thank you. Come find me tomorrow, before your shift. Dahlia nodded. She turned to go. She stopped. One more thing, she said. The rating sheet, the performance record for tonight. She was choosing her words with the deliberateness of someone delivering information they are glad to deliver. Hazel filed it at 0250. I happened to see the assessment column when she was moving it to the complete stack. Ivy waited. It said performed exceptionally. Dahlia paused. That's the highest rating on the scale. In 11 years, she has given it 4 times. She left. Ivy stood at the glass. The monitor beeped. Grace's hand rested near Caleb's. Ranger's chest rose and fell in the hallway. She stood there for a long time. At 0429 hours, her phone vibrated. She looked at the screen. Unregistered number. The particular format of the number, the way the prefix sat before the digits, was one she recognized. She had seen it twice before, in different contexts. In years she no longer used a civilian phone. She held the phone in her hand. It vibrated 3 times. Stopped. She put it in her pocket. Klein materialized at the corridor junction. He was still in his civilian clothes, still carrying the particular posture of someone who has not spent enough years outside of uniform to forget what it felt like. He stopped 10 feet away and looked at her. That was them, he said. Yes. They know you received it. Yes. Klein came to stand beside her. He looked at the observation glass, at the room, at Ranger in the hallway. The second name, he said, in the MIA file. You already know who it is. Yes. And you know something about where they are. Ivy looked at the window at the end of the corridor, the dark glass, the early morning dark beyond it. I've known for a while, she said. Klein absorbed this as he looked at Ranger. The dog's ears had moved, the minimal adjustment of an animal that is monitoring while appearing to rest. One ear tracking the conversation 20 feet away. The third operation, Klein said. The one that doesn't have a name. Yes. What happened? Ivy was quiet for a moment. We found something, she said. Something that we were not supposed to find, in a place that we were not supposed to be. And after that, everything changed. Klein looked at her. Changed how? Changed in the way that things change, she said, when powerful people have a reason to want you, not to be able to say what you saw. The corridor moved around them, a gurney at the far end, the distant sound of a radio, the ventilation system's ordinary breath. The fluorescent lights produced their unwavering quality of illumination over everything. The tile floor, the scheduling boards, the window of the observation glass, and the woman standing in front of it with a torn scrub top and 14 years of classified history, and a phone in her pocket with an unanswered call from people who had declared her dead and were now calling because they needed her to do something again. Klein said nothing for a long time. One more time, he said finally. It was not a question. It was the recognition of a pattern. Ivy looked at him. That's always how it starts, he said. She turned toward the observation glass. Through it, Caleb was sleeping with the stable numbers on his monitor and his mother's hand near his. Ranger's ear was still tracking. The IV dripped in its ordinary way. The dog has been with him for 3 years, Ivy said. Since Mosul. I know. Ranger knew me, she said. When I came around that corner, he already knew. Klein looked at Ranger, at the ear tracking their voices from 20 feet away, at the slow, even breathing of an animal that had maintained its post for 7 hours and was now resting because it knew its work for this particular night was complete. How is that possible? Klein asked. I trained him, Ivy said simply. Before Mosul, before the third operation, before everything. She paused. He was 12 weeks old. I spent 4 months with him before they assigned him to Caleb's unit. Klein stared at the dog. And he recognized you. He recognized me, she said. After 3 years and a different name and different clothes and a different building. He recognized me, and he let me in. And everyone in that corridor was too busy looking at me to look at what the dog was telling them. She turned from the glass. Real warriors don't advertise, she said to herself, to the corridor. The particular quality of 0430 in a facility that had started this evening as one thing and had become, over the course of it, something else. That's what the old sergeant used to say, 0530 Kandahar province, while we were all trying to keep our eyes open. She stopped. He was right. They never do. She walked toward the corridor junction. She moved at the same pace she had used all evening, unhurried, purposeful, the pace of someone who knows where they are going and what the next step requires. She stopped at Ranger's position in the hallway. She crouched down. The dog lifted his head, the amber eyes finding hers immediately, the recognition in them as complete and uncomplicated as it had been when she rounded the corner 7 hours ago. She put her hand on his head. He pressed into it. She stayed there for a moment. Then she stood. She looked at the door of Trauma Bay 3, at the monitor visible through the glass, at the numbers on it. She took the phone out of her pocket. She looked at the screen, the missed call, the number in its particular format. Her thumb moved to the callback function. She held it there. Behind her, at the edge of her peripheral vision, Klein had not moved. Cole had appeared at the corridor junction without either of them having noticed. The 2 officers stood at the edge of the corridor and watched her with the attention of people who understand that a decision is being made and know better than to interrupt it. Ranger looked up at her. She looked at him. She looked at the window at the corridor's end, the dark glass, the early morning beyond it, the lights on the access road below, a world that did not yet know what the next hour would bring. She pressed call. The phone rang once. Connected. She held it to her ear. She said, "One more time." The corridor held its breath. Ranger lay back down on his paws. His eyes stayed open. Tracking. Present. Ready. Outside the observation glass, the monitor showed its numbers in their stable, hard-won sequence. Caleb Harrow was breathing. Grace was sleeping in the chair beside him. The IV dripped. The ventilation moved the air through its ducts in the ordinary way. And in the hallway of Bethesda Naval Medical Center's trauma wing, at 0431 on a Saturday morning, Ivy stood with a phone pressed to her ear and her eyes on the dark glass in her left collarbone, bearing the mark of a unit that everyone in the relevant files had agreed was finished, and said the words that people say when they have been trying to stop doing the thing they are best at and have run out of convincing reasons to keep trying. The lights did not change. The building continued its business. The dog did not move. somewhere in a database that required a clearance level that most of the people in that corridor would never possess. A file that had been marked inactive for 3 years shifted its status. 2 names, one confirmed, one pending. The field beside each name, the field reserved for current operational status, waited for its next entry. It did not have to wait long.